down the
Okay, it just started. That's
okay, the two announcements down here, if Lou didn't mention it upstairs, if you'd please not connect any devices to the Wi-Fi. We think that may have been the cause of some intermittent breakup last week. And again, the reminder that the restrooms are straight down the hallway out there if nature calls. The topic this evening is economic warfare. It occurred to me in looking at the article in the workbook that the term itself is probably confusing because it subsumes a lot of very different forms of international interaction, decision-making, policy, prescription. So what I'm going to attempt to do this evening is to demystify, increase understanding. What I'm not going to do is lay out the arguments for or against uses of sanctions, other forms of economic warfare in particular cases. Happy to talk about that in question and answer. But I think it's going to take me all of my allotted time to try and get some of the concepts straight, or at least a little clearer in everybody's mind, or at least give everybody a common understanding. And that Robert asked me appropriately a few minutes ago what my background was on this subject. It's one that I've worked on off and on since the late 1970s. When I was on the advisory panel for the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, we were charged with rewriting the Export Administration Act, export controls, to try and come up with a better template, better schema, better rationalization for deciding what to control, what not to control, how to control it. We worked on it for 2 years and failed.
Another one of those great decisions?
Yeah.
Or what's it on this week?
I'm sorry, I didn't. People on Zoom,
On
please
what?
mute your.
Jim, could you please mute
I'm
yourself?
sorry?
Jim Cornett, could you please mute yourself?
Oh, sorry. Is that we worked on it for 2 years. And we found it ultimately impossible to use the schema that we were asked to develop of identifying keystone technologies, was the phrase at the time. That if you blocked access to that keystone technology, you could pretty much let everything else go because it wouldn't work unless you had the key. But technology kept moving faster than regulatory writing could take place. And we simply, we, the United States and the international community under the Coordinating Committee for Export Controls, simply maintained the expiring rules for another 2 years until something replaced it. That I worked at it intensively toward the end of my career in Washington when I was the Stuckey for the analytical piece of the Committee on Investment in the United States, Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, which is housed in the Treasury Department. But the analysis of risk from particular countries and companies was assigned to me. So I've worked at bookended in stages of my career and on and off in between that. It's one that I got a reputation for being hostile to uses of sanctions, uses of dimensions of economic warfare. I don't think they work very well. I don't think they're appropriate very often. But part of what I'll talk about tonight, hopefully in a reasonably objective way, is the allure and the growing allure of using sanctions and other forms of economic warfare, and an increasing paranoia about other countries using economic warfare directed at the United States. But let me start with some very basic discussions of what economic warfare is, what's subsumed under that. And in many ways, this is a logical follow-on to the presentation last week of war crimes that, as Alan Weiner laid out, it subsumes many, many things that have been interpreted differently at different times by different players. So there's a dimension of economic warfare ways, and it's a part of warfare. The flippant expression, everything is fair in love and war, applies in this respect, in all-out warfare, the two world wars, as premier recent examples, use of economic measures to shorten the period of conflict, by shortening the period of conflict, to shorten the damage to lives and property on all sides. That use of embargoes, use of blockades, economic sabotage against the enemy are all parts of long-standing, in wartime, accepted instruments of we've more recently expanded that definition to include acts short of violence, military violence, intended to weaken an adversary in some way by stealing proprietary information, by subverting power systems, by penetrating controllers and control mechanisms in industrial processes and the like. This is a much more highly debated and debatable proposition. When does that differ from good old-fashioned industrial espionage? Company A stealing information from company B in order to enhance the bottom line. When is the state enterprise targeting at a private firm in a different country? Is that warfare, or is that searching for an unfair competitive advantage? And there's no automatic or regulatory prescribed international more recently, last 2 decades or so, the concept has been used much more frequently to describe a point along a spectrum of possible government actions that ranges from do nothing, whatever the presumed trigger event is in the external environment, an economic attack, human rights violations, violations of territorial water or land sovereignty, that there's always the option to do nothing. An option that was pretty close to the one adopted after Russia seized the Crimea in 2014. The more or less unified and uniform response was to do nothing. At the other end of that spectrum is all-out war. That and even within that spectrum, there's both action and threats of action. Do you threaten warfare as a part of either an effort to deter a particular action or to punish a particular action. And there are people who say that the most important role of warfare is to deter, to persuade somebody not to do it, because if you do it, you're going to come down gangbusters. But mostly the economic warfare is thought of as that it's necessary to respond in some way, but in an era of nuclear weapons, great reluctance to respond kinetically with conventional weapons because of the danger of escalation. And as conventional weapons become more and more precise and lethal, there's an understandable and appropriate reluctance to even threaten to go that far. So finding something in the space. Nations differ as to how large the space is between doing nothing and warfare, and how many different ways you can slice the salami. I should take this off. Slice the salami to parse out appropriate economic responses to military action, to political action, to behavior by non-state actors, terrorist groups, for example, in their, where do you come down? It's usually depicted as preferable to warfare and as preferable to doing nothing, because doing nothing is argued undercuts the credibility of alliance commitments, undercuts the credibility for the United States of our extended nuclear umbrella, where we agree to protect non-nuclear weapon states through the use of our nuclear arsenal. So it's a matter of face and appearances and credibility for some who talk about this. That however defined precisely or applied in a particular instance, this version of economic warfare is intended to limit the capacity of an actual or prospective adversary. It shouldn't be a feel-good gesture. You make a pronouncement, you declare something, it's intended to hurt the other party in some way. This is where it gets very tricky. Who's the other party? Are you imposing this pain on another country? On a set of leaders in another country? On an industrial sector in another country? On the population writ large? They will put pressure on leaders in their own system to cease and desist whatever the problematic behavior is. That during the Cold War, the policy of containment utilized economic weapons to maintain the ability and interaction by the Soviet Union and its allies, because the Cold War was defined as an existential conflict. Use of all means possible was rationalized and justified, and denying access to finance, denying access to particular set of technology, denying access to training in the United States and allied partners, and the reverse was done toward us. It was just a part of what was understood to be the rules of that engagement over decades. That using a limited instrument, surgical precision, is desirable if unattainable here to target. And Biden administration advocated, congressionally approved restrictions on technology to China, the CHIPS Act, directed against China to deny access to advanced chips and chip manufacturing capability. it attempts to target one portion of the electronics sector in the country. Partly this is retribution for theft of intellectual property, which has been going on large scale. Partly it is a preemptive move among those that think China is advancing more rapidly than the United States or United States plus allies and needs to be slowed up while we play catch up. There are lots of rationales, and who advocates what does not always use the same rationale. A decade been at least tangentially involved in this. The most common use has been coercive, to persuade, to induce another country to do or refrain from doing things, rather than punitive. That Congress likes this sort of preemptive, if you do X, Y and Z follow, because they think that forces the administration, whatever the administration is, to do what made members of Congress feel good preemptively. A good example, probably the best example of this, was passage of legislation by the Congress in the 1970s, specifying a number of sanctions that would be leveled on India or Pakistan, or India and Pakistan, if they tested a nuclear device. These were enacted after India did its first so-called peaceful nuclear test. And this was intended, according to the authors of the legislation, to deter the emergence of two more nuclear powers. Well, in 1998, they both tested. The administration at the time was mousetrapped in applying those congressionally mandated sanctions. And it underscored the great weakness of drawing a red line you don't want to enforce, imposing sanctions as a deterrent, but if they don't deter, then you have to live with the consequences. And what it meant in the case to manage the fact that they now had nuclear capabilities because of the diplomatic restrictions, the technological restrictions, the trade restrictions that were, it took away all of the carrots and all of the meaningful sticks that could have been used. And it took a matter of years to work around that seemed like a good idea at the time, use of economic warfare. Some of these coercive uses of economic instruments are intended to change the behavior, if not the regime, that is disliked by the imposing country. And we assume I'm talking about the United States here, but it applies to other countries. We're not the only ones who do this. Cuba. The United States imposed sanctions on Cuba because of the violations of human rights and other offenses in the late 1950s. Sanctions were imposed in 1958. Most of them are still in place. And it's the classic negative example here. The people who think sanctions are a good idea, that they just need a little more time. That maybe next year, the regime in Cuba will change in some way. So it underscores the wishful thinking character of it. But along the way, it's posed real pain on the people of Cuba, but it has been largely avoided by all countries other than the United States, who don't agree with the sanctions, and simply provide end runs, workarounds that would make it makes it possible, but it'll be much easier if we could have direct interaction with Cuba. Different kind of sanctions put on Iranian and Iraqi different times, exports of oil. Unlike the Cuba sanctions, which were unilateral by the United States, the ones on Iran monitored fees attached to it, that it limited the capacity to generate revenue to meet internal needs and therefore the capacity of the regime. Yes.
How would they impose sanctions against Iraq and Iran to export somewhere else? Which is the Navy, our Navy is sworn
Now, these were done under the United Nations. The question was, how could sanctions be imposed on Iran and Iraq to export oil to other people? And the answer is these were done through the United Nations, which made it illegal, technically, for any country to purchase oil from Iran or Iraq at the times these sanctions were imposed, without going through the procedures that were imposed by the Security Council. That some of the money that was paid was escrowed, for example, was put in an account and not made available to the selling government. But the point Peter's question raises is one of it's hard to enforce unilateral sanctions. It's still hard, even when it's endorsed by the United Nations. The world is a big place. It's a leaky place. There are ways of doing things. Oil is a fungible commodity that you can switch it around pretty easily. That somebody's gotten permission, they've bought it out, but they've traded it while the oil is on the high seas. Send it to Latin America or send it to Africa, where the distances are shorter, the shipping costs are less. So keeping track of it is very, very difficult. Voluntary compliance, and here the one that is working actually is called the Proliferation Security Initiative, or PSI. These are sanctions imposed on North Korea for its missile program and its nuclear weapons program. It has to do with enforcement of restrictions imposed by the Security Council. The Security Council doesn't have the military. It doesn't have a way to enforce other than moral suasion. The PSI is a voluntary grouping of countries that have naval forces in the vicinity of North Korea or close to shipping lanes used by North Korea, used by other countries shipping to the north, that stop, search, and if they find anything they shouldn't be there, to seize. Where the line is between piracy on the high seas and acting as the United Nations police force is a blurry one. If you're a good guy, then you say, I'm on the right and just side of this, doing what the Security Council has mandated. If you don't like interference by any actor international, including the United Nations, looks like piracy. The use of sanctions, Security Council sanctions, in the last 2 decades have been most frequent with respect to North Korea, which underscores the problem here. Fairly easy to get the votes necessary in the Security Council to condemn North Korea's nuclear weapons testing, for example. Missile tests after the UN said they couldn't test. But China and Russia have vetoes on the Security Council. So they've got a marked, pronounced say in the character of the sanctions imposed. What specifically is sanctioned? And they regularly, particularly China in this case, want to keep the door open for humanitarian relief. These should be sanctions condemning the nuclear sanction in North Korea. And again, the line gets pretty fuzzy here. And I'll make it real fuzzy with an Iran example. That sanctions imposed after 1979 preclude providing aircraft replacement spare parts. The Iran government still owns United States. US, the question is who imposed these sanctions? The United States imposed these sanctions. A large portion of the commercial airline fleet of Iran is comprised of Boeing aircraft. Boeing has been forbidden for decades from selling parts. But those commercial airliners carry civilians, they carry American citizens. Is it moral to keep denying them parts that are important for the safe operation of these aircraft? It's been addressed by, we're not changing the rule. The sanction remains in place, but I can't see what's going on because I put my hand in front of my eyes, that the parts go in through a third country. Yeah, they could, but you don't want to hurt innocent people aspect about this. You don't want to explain why the plane that crashed carrying some number of American citizens crashed because of the parts that were requested and denied. So, and you can take that analog and multiply it by almost as many examples of sanctions as there are. The final variant of economic warfare measures of sanctions that's been a lot, secondary sanctions, that the sanctions imposed by NATO plus, that have denied access to lots of things to Russia, carry with them provisions that if another country, Turkey, China, Argentina, whoever, if they sell arms or ammunition, if they sell technologies needed in the oil and gas industry and other of these things, they are subject to sanction. And that carries weight as a deterrent. Because this group of voluntary sanctions, secondary sanctions, and in South deny, take an example out of the news, the Biden administration releasing information that China was considering selling weapons to Russia a couple of weeks ago. My guess is they probably were considering it. But in order to influence their considerations, the Biden administration publicized it and made very clear that that would invoke secondary sanctions. What can secondary sanctions entail? As have already been applied in other cases on Russia. No access to the US financial system. And give or take, 99% of all financial transactions in the world go through New York. That's the way the system works. The ones that don't go through New York go through London. You can choke off completely access to the international, so you can't pay your bills. And who will trade with you if you might subject your civil? Who's going to sell you oil denominated in dollars if you might do things that get you sanctioned so you can't get access to dollars? So it can be an effective measure, but again, the world is a big interconnected place. And the secondary sanctions have been more trade is a really important part of their economy. Then against ones it's not such a big part. So a lot of things that have been proscribed for transfer to Russia are getting there through the former states of the former Soviet Union, through Turkey, as one that seems to be heavily engaged in this. But Turkey is a member of NATO. You need NATO unanimity to preserve other forms of assistance to Ukraine. So do you really want to enforce that sanctions possibility? There are no easy calls on this ever, because you never have one interest vis-a-vis another player. You've always got multiple ones that are more important to some players, some constituents in the United States than they are to others. I'm going to turn to that now. Sanctions, who is affected by them, who likes them. What I'm planning to do in the remainder of the initial time here is talk about the allure of sanctions, why they're difficult to implement, and some of the consequences of attempting to do so. That, to underscore a point I made at the beginning, I think it's useful, even important, to distinguish between the use of economic instruments during a time of actual warfare to limit the capacity or cripple capacity of I want to focus on that in between doing nothing and going to war portion of the spectrum. That during a shooting war, again, the sanctions are intended to shorten the warfare. That's the rationale. Make the other guy give up sooner. And they're trying to do the same thing to us by using economic and other means. That kind of things in warfare, the German submarine warfare, World War I, to prevent materials from getting to the United Kingdom. World War II and World War I, United Kingdom blockading food to Germany. Make the people withdraw support from the regime by making them hungry. Acceptable behavior at the time of World War II, much less acceptable today. That the humanitarian law been an evolution over time that's more restrictive about what can be done even with the economic warfare. The other form in the Cold War, the containment, to limit the capacity of others that were directed at Soviet Union first of all. As it formed alliances with what became known as the Warsaw Pact, the Central European states, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and China. When China allied in 1950, became subject to containment. Containment was to limit the military capability of the adversary, by limiting industrial capacity, by limiting overall economic capacity. Almost no trade, almost no financial interaction, almost no exchanges of intellectual people engaged in academia or study or students and so forth. That at one way of measuring it, this form of containment was effective. It limited the capacity of the target countries. But there's a however clause that needs to be added. All of these countries in this period were attempting to become self-reliant. They sought autarky. So it's like hitting a masochist, right? You hit a masochist, began imposing this kind of constraints on a country that doesn't want trade, that wants to have total control of key parts of their economy to reduce vulnerabilities to it. Helping them the goal they want to achieve, and providing justification for the argument that we're doing all of these things that you, the people of our country, don't like. We have to do it because of the containment policy imposed by the hostile forces led by the United States. And there's a technological dimension that comes into play, and the CHIPS Act directed at China is relevant here, that if you make it impossible for the other party to buy what is desired, you almost guarantee that they're going to devote a lot of effort to developing the capacity to make it themselves. So you've delayed, maybe by some period of time, the constraints. Soviet Union delayed for a few years their acquisition of nuclear weapons, but they got it anyway. But you do something more than delay the other guy. Whose technology are you constraining and not selling? The technology of private sector firms, by and large. So if the government policy is all the companies in this sector cannot sell to that country, you've just opened up that market to somebody else. And what's the likelihood of getting it back after sanctions? Pretty small. And that's a general problem with sanctions for governments. Governments want to impose them, or they talk about imposing them a lot. But they're playing with somebody else's chips. Government doesn't own this stuff. Private sector does. Boards of directors, shareholders may share outrage at the Russians in Ukraine. How much are they willing to forego in terms of future market share? Laying earnings on sunk cost investments, that they have a stake, and because they have a stake, you know, they have a say here in what gets decided. And carve-outs. You can stand on your soapbox and you can proclaim till the cows come home, but it's not going to include this piece. And if that piece happens to be a keystone or a keystone, going back to what I said about the 70s, you've got at best feel good, and at most according differential advantages and cost to different components in your own economy on here. So it's hard to get approval for sanctions. In theory, these are preferable to going to war and doing nothing. But the rubber hits the road with the implementation, and the implementation is very much a function of whose ox gets gored in the path, in the course of applying these. Sometimes the allure, the appeal of sanctions is, I don't have to act now. This is a bad problem. But do I have to act now? And I would say in all of the years that I was providing analytic support to policymakers, a common, very common dynamic, you bring them some kind of bad news. So is it really that bad? I say, yeah, it really is that bad. Do I have to do something about it? Your decision. You decide whether or not. Do I have to do something about it now? Again, your decision, whether you have to do something about it now. Will this just go away if I don't do anything? It might. It might. How long will it take to go away by itself, or to figure out if it's going to resolve itself? Don't know. Behind those questions is where do I have to put this in the hierarchy of things I'm trying to do? What price will I need to pay in order to address that problem? Can I kick this down the road long enough that it becomes somebody else's problem? Because I'm out of here in 3 years. And that's that's just human reaction. It's an almost inevitable bureaucratic reaction. We've got to get agreement among, say, dozens of components that have an interest in but also in the political arena. Back to the private firms whose ox stands to get gored. Who's the most powerful political actor in the United States system? Business. That's where the money for politics comes from. If they don't want things to happen, they go to the members of Congress that they've funded and said, do the right thing. They don't have to threaten. It can be pretty implicit. But all of this is a constraint and a break on how often, how severe, and how effective the sanctions can be. That because it's difficult to secure approval, the same factors make it difficult to apply, to implement. And unlike warfare, right, where Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, we declared war. Hitler responded by declaring war on the United States because we had declared war on Japan. There's no ambiguity, right? We're in a big time shooting war here. Ukraine, a lot of declarations that the Ukraine survival of its territorial integrity, survival of the democratic government is critical to all democratic countries. Certainly all democratic countries in Europe is the way it's framed. You can be persuaded by that characterization, but I think it doesn't require much imagination. That's very different than they attacked me with airplanes bombing the fleet in there. One gets everybody all in pretty quick. The other one is the first set of questions: sanctions applied by whom within the system? And how do you enforce sanctions against your own people, your own companies, your own transport systems in here, that it can become an all-consuming action that is going to be happening in the context of other countries going through the same kind of calculations and perhaps deciding it's not in our interest to enforce these things rigorously. We're not going to do it. So that's the reality that it plays out. So making it work is hard. To make it work, to make economic sanctions as that component of economic warfare work, you really have to have very substantial buy-in from the public, very substantial buy-in from the sectors involved, which means the shareholders in those sectors, which very quickly gets to be you and me, right? The shares owned by pension funds, by insurance companies, which have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize return for the people they serve in this. So personally, you can be outraged. We got to do something about that. So, well, if what you're going to do about it is going to reduce your earnings in your retirement account, well, not so fast. Can't we find something else that we can bring to the table? And the problem is every alternative steps on somebody else's wallet, or maybe steps on your wallet, again, just in a different pocket. So it gets very tricky to figure out how to justify it and explain it. It's much easier sanctions that are highly targeted at specific individuals, specific factories, that after 9/11, we, as part of the Bush administration here, spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do sanctions targeted at terrorist groups, terrorist finance, movement of weapons around. The Thugs R Us networks that supported international terrorism. And the Treasury Department got to be pretty good at it. And they figured out ways to impose the sanctions that allowed banks, primarily, this is Treasury banks, to worry about reputational risk. Surely you wouldn't want it to become known that you were providing the means by which Al-Qaeda or ISIS finances its terrorists conducting attacks in Europe or against the United States in there. And if you're talking about magnitude of financial activity undertaken by non-state actors, this is not a big part of anybody's bottom line. So you get cooperation and you get the means to cut it off with a high degree of specificity. Because with all of the trillions of dollars that fly around the international system every day, you can pinpoint it went from Bill to Janet. They may be on totally opposite ends of the world, but it takes you a matter of seconds and you know that that transaction happened. So you don't even have to interrupt it. You say, we know you did that. Don't do it again. And that has proven pretty effective. The sanctions that have been targeted at individual Russians, much element to it, that we don't like them because they're oligarchs. They're oligarchs who profit from the system. They profit from their relationship with Putin. But they're not trying to do the kind of things that terrorists were trying to do. So seizing their yacht probably makes them mad. It's not going to knock them out of business here. And they've probably got it insured anyway by this point. So it'll be the American-owned insurance company that pays for the seizure of their yacht. That the complexity of the global system, the gap that often exists between understandable outrage and frustration at how little can be done effectively to remove the cause of that outrage. And a lingering misimpression of how preeminent the United States is in the world. That, old numbers, but often at the end of World War II, the United States was responsible for more than 50% of global economic activity. We're still incredibly preeminent, but it's down to about 24, 25%, which ain't bad. We're only 4.5% of the world's people. It's a pretty impressive performance. But within that 25%, the gap between us and everybody else in terms of technological, financial, other capability is much smaller. It's much smaller in part because of the success of US policy that aimed at making our partners and allies stronger, more capable, more prosperous, because that made the alliance stronger, more capable, more prosperous, and prosperous friends buy more stuff, and it made us more prosperous in there. So the policies worked, but they worked in a way that reduces close to the decision-making level, don't understand how narrow the gap is and the significance of the narrowing of the gap. So the imagination about, boy, if we slap sanctions on North Korea, they'll have no choice but to knuckle under. And the sanctions on North Korea is the only one that's been in place longer than the sanctions on Cuba. Maybe it just needs a little time. They've only been in place since 1950. Maybe 73 years isn't quite long enough yet. That the willful disregard of reality, the lack of appreciation for how much the world has changed contributes to this. We don't want to fight. We certainly don't want to get in a position that could lead to nuclear conflict. Well, we got to do something. So let's slap sanctions on them. Close with a few sentences about consequences. If you use economic measures of whatever kind to deter bad behavior, you really need to think it through. What do I do if deterrence fails? A lot of the logic for this comes out of the nuclear mutual assured destruction. You do that. You use one nuclear weapon. We're going to obliterate you. Or we'll wipe out all of your military capacity. Or in an earlier period here, we'll wipe out your 10 largest cities. The immorality of threatening civilians finally sunk in on all sides, so we don't do that anymore. And we pretend that you can put a nice, clean nuclear weapon on a military facility, and it won't hurt the civilians living around it, which of course it would. But if the sanctions fail, if deterrence fails, what do you do? And this is not just economic sanctions, it's red lines more broadly. And one that comes up over and over again from the Obama administration is you declare a red line on use of chemical weapons by Syria. And they use them. And there is a contingent, most of them happen to be Republicans, that still rants and raves of Obama and the administration wimping out, didn't follow through on the red line. Well, it didn't follow through with military action, followed through with an international agreement negotiated with the Russians in the lead to extract the remaining chemical weapons from Syria. And what was thought to be all of them at the time, monitored by the International Convention Group that does chemical weapons, hauled out of the country and destroyed. Did they get them all? No. But this is a win, right? But it's a win depicted as a loss because it threatened military action and didn't carry out the military action. Because when push came to shove, a negotiated solution was thought to be preferable.
Yeah, there's.
Yeah.
The president couldn't declare war without Congress backing him up against Syria. He was getting tired out of going to Iraq. All those men in Iraq were slowly brought back, and so we didn't want to start that whole thing. So it's Congress that's claims it as a win now, but it's not the administration that has the choice there.
Yeah, Peters brought up a question about Congress not approving use of force resolutions, can't go to war without congressional approval. And you anticipated me, Peter, because that's where I was going, that constitutionally, Congress can declare war, not the president. But as the commander in chief, the president can take actions that he or she deem necessary to protect the security and safety of the United States. So that's a gray area that because of anger over the conduct of the Vietnam War, something was passed in the 70s called the War Powers Act, which requires the president to go to Congress for approval. But again, during the Obama administration, he got a lot of criticism for threatening to go to Congress and ask for a resolution authorizing the use of force in Libya. And Congress reacted with don't ask us that question, that would be outrageous. You're the commander in chief, you're a wimp, make the decision. The reluctance to be put on the spot is real. There's being debated now, I guess it's two separate resolutions to withdraw the resolution authorizing use of force in Iraq, that Peter mentioned, that would presidents have asked to, including Biden, have said, I don't want this resolution, take it away. I want to come back. Any president should have to come back to the Congress for that. It may or may not pass. You would think this is one where legislative branch would want to reclaim constitutional authority, but they don't want to have to make hard choices in it.
They're holding the purse, and we spent trillions of dollars with our men in Iraq.
Right.
And the whole argument of the Republicans and Congress is they don't want to set more men at risk,
Right.
But they're making money, but their states are making all our weapons that we export. All these weapons are being built in the southern part of the country. Most of them aren't the main artillery stuff.
Yeah, that it's a comment that I hope got picked up through the microphone, but Congress being reluctant to take measures that put men and women in harm's way in combat when they're in many of the districts are manufacturing articles of war and making money from the process. And there's a third difference that's worth noting from ancient history. Like the draft that caught me up at the time of the Vietnam War. Then we now have a professional military, no draft. Today, only 1% of American families have somebody serving in the military, as opposed to way in excess of 50% in the Second War, pretty close to 50% at the time of the Vietnam War. That it like the sanctions, it's playing with somebody else's chips. And here the chips are the lives of somebody else's children. And that it's a nonsensical situation, but there's now a superabundance of courage in stepping up to this. Let me close with an observation or prediction of sorts that as countries, including the United States in this, become ever more averse to kinetic warfare. We've been lucky that with the tiny exception of the attack on Pearl Harbor, we've been protected by those two big moats called the Pacific and the Atlantic, and two friendly countries, Canada and Mexico. But long-range weaponry, precision weaponry, I know of nobody who thinks that we can fight in a away game the next time we fight. It's going to be here as well as there. And understandably, no country, sensible country, wants to put itself in that. So how do you demonstrate resolve and outrage? And do something means greater allure of sanctions, which will have negative consequences at home as well as abroad. I believe they will continue to be minimally effective. At best, it's playing for time till you figure out some other way to address the problem. Let me stop there and open it up to questions here. And Lou, you'll field them on Zoom?
Right, at this point, we have no questions in the chat, so why don't you take them in the room?
Okay, Peter?
I can still remember President Nixon saying that the Third World War was going to be an economic war. And what do you think of the inflation? You're saying we have a friendly neighbor to the south, but I'm wondering, what do you think of the inflation happening in this state with food and with rent and the way people are at each other's throats? They don't even put prices on food now in stores. You have to kind of go up to the cashier and just see if there is discount.
The question is, what about inflation, as has resulted in part from the invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions imposed? That I'm not dismissing the question, but we have
the immigration problem. It's not just Ukraine, but the gradual influx of the culture of food and service. Food and service is going up in price.
Yeah, let me take
hospice, including the end of life issue.
Let me take there's lots of things in here, and lots of them are 2 or 3 steps. They're not unrelated, but they're 2 or 3 steps separate. But let me take food, because they're very much in the news, right? Going back a year ago, when the Russians were preventing the Ukrainians from exporting grain, a major grain exporting country. The Turks negotiated with the United Nations an agreement that allowed the grain to be exported. Why would the Russians agree to that, right? Not want to use that economic weapon to weaken the financial capacity of Ukraine, its ability to pay its troops, to pay its bureaucrats, pay its farmers. And you don't have to dig very far. A lot of attention was placed on grain to Africa and the cost of grain going up worldwide, and that imposing a particularly severe burden on the poor people of Africa. Where did most of Ukraine's grain go, though? China. China was and is the largest purchaser of grain from Ukraine. Why did Putin agree to let it go? He wants to keep the Chinese, at least rhetorically, on his side of the line here. So the blockade I don't think he was really too worried about hungry people in Africa. He worried about the 30+% of Ukrainian grain that goes to China. And the political blowback that would have. So it illustrates the complexity of the interconnections that are there. Inflation always has many causes. Part of it was energy, part of it was price gouging and windfall profits. Part of it was weather and decreased crops production, lots of places that to explain complexity is almost always a loser, right? Whether you're a politician or a speaker of some kind. If you can have one or two illustrative factors and say that's what caused it, people are likely to get it. But what they get is wrong, right? They get they think they understand it, but don't in full measure. And I think the important point for the economic warfare, the topic of this talk, is so many things are interconnected. Most of them, those interconnections are positive. They're win-win relationships that take advantage of comparative advantage to get lowest cost at the end of this. That makes it increasingly difficult to conceive of, let alone implement, economic warfare measures that don't hurt people you don't want to hurt or don't produce consequences. And price inflation is one of them. And I think out of Ukraine that's a small factor. But all of these things are cumulative. So global warming and drought that has reduced agricultural production in lots of places that requires more international shipments of food, that takes away from carrying capacity for other commodities, that screws up supply chain and raises the prices of stuff because of competition. That, economists can describe it much more eloquently than I can. I'm in sort of the layman's mode. But all of those things have the dual effect, again, for purposes of the article and this talk, of increasing the appeal of using economic levers. There's so many more of them. And it increases the difficulty of actually implementing them successfully, because you've got so many people who are going to be hurt and so many capacities for them to interfere or intervene in the political process to get it changed. And change means dumb it down, dilute it, make it less effective, not make it more effective because I want more pain. I want to pay more at Walmart. That's not the way people argue. Any other questions here? I see we've got one on screen, Lou. What happened to Lou? There was a.
It works better if I unmute myself. So basically, the comment is, I assume the targeted sanctions against Putin's inner circle have not been successful, to persuade Putin to withdraw from Ukraine. Can you comment on how well or they have or have not worked?
Yeah, the question is, how well have sanctions against Putin's inner circle worked or not worked? That from the things that I read, and I don't claim to follow in excruciating detail the Russia situation or Russia-Ukraine situation, but it appears that most of those who have been targeted have remained loyal to Putin, remain loyal to the regime from which they benefit. I mean, there is a sort of an enlightened self-interest element here. If Putin goes, their protection goes. So they've got every incentive in the world to hang with them or hang separately. So it's easy to target them because they're outlandish in their displays of wealth. But taking away tens of millions of dollars from billionaires that's chump change. That's pocket change. So it doesn't have much of an effect. And imposing measures that really do hit ordinary people, it's hard to tell which of those have been responsible for, the estimates are between 1 and 2 million Russians that have left the country in the last year. A lot of that is attributed to ire at the invasion of Ukraine. But did they leave because they're mad at Putin? They leave because they're embarrassed by their country's behavior? Did they leave because the sanctions have hit them in ways that they find painful? Some of the industrial, some of the academic exchange, collaborative projects in there is probably as many explanations for success and failure as there are people involved in this. But the net, I got you, Robert, the net effect has been characterized by a former colleague of mine as all the liberals have left Russia. That's what Putin accomplished. Now, that the followers of Navalny, those who want a different kind of regime, whether for fear of being drafted or anger at what they're doing, they've left the country. So after Putin, what? Who picks up the pieces? And the people who might pick up the pieces and put them together in a way that you'd like to see happen, they're outside. How long do they stay outside before say, I'm not ever going back? I got a new life. Robert?
Can you confirm my understanding is that Russia was okay when they first started invading Ukraine, was pretty much cut off from the international finance community. For example, my understanding is if you travel to Russia, your Visa card or MasterCard don't work. And you pointed out earlier that 85% of all transactions goes through the United States or London. So how is Russia surviving sanctions?
The question is, the sanctions were imposed on Russia's financial system almost immediately after the invasion of Ukraine that did cut off international credit card access, bank-to-bank transactions substantially. How is the economy surviving? Very much depends on which analyst answers the question as to how severe, how short-term or long-term the implications are, and which piece of the system. The denial of access to the international banking system, the SWIFT system, it's called bank-to-bank transfers, had an immediate negative impact on a lot of consumer goods, individual credit card kinds of use. So you get immediate pain that put this in the category of McDonald's pulled out of, and Starbucks pulled out of Russia. Probably hurt McDonald's more than it hurt Russia. Other than the hurt feelings of the Russian people, more directed at the foreigners doing this to them for something their leader did than it is blaming the leader because they lost Big Macs on there. So the impact there was big, immediate, and it found workarounds. The credit cards, it turns out that the Russian credit cards, and they could get them replaced here, states of the former Soviet Union that are around the periphery where most of the Russians are going now that they can't go other places. Again, they're okay. If they got out, they can use their cards to do whatever they want to do, where they're portions of the sale of oil and gas. So this is what matters, right? The majority of income, the vast majority of state income in Russia is from sales of oil and gas, and most of the rest is metals and minerals and timber. There's not a lot of industrial exports. Most of what used to go to Europe has been picked up by China, paid for in a ruble, yuan, Chinese currency, Russian currency, swap arrangement that even if they set the value in dollars, they didn't convert it, but they pay one another in their own currencies. So they've got income coming from it. It's not dollars. It's not over the long term. It makes them more dependent on China because it's not as fungible to use to buy stuff in Europe, which is where most of their non-energy resource trade was. So how long this will take before it bites which sector, which individuals, is still uncertain. The expectations clearly were that this was going to have a bigger and more impactful effect on the economy and the society than it has had. But that's very different than saying the long-term effect is insignificant, because the companies that don't have access to inputs today in Russia are not developing next generation technologies, not getting into markets early on, something that they're in an ever deepening hole because of the sanctions that down the road, it's clearly going to limit what Russia can do. It's obviously not yet enough pain to have an impact on what they're doing in Ukraine. And Putin clearly thinks time is on his side, that the West will lose the will to fight to the last Ukrainian before he runs out of desire to kill the last Ukrainian. It's a pretty harsh way to put it, but I think that's his calculus. Lou, do you have any others? There's no more in the room. I cannot have explained it so clearly. Something I said must have confused people, even or challenged. Let me go, Diane.
I'm just feeling like, what do we do? I'm just feeling like, what can we do about this? I actually enjoyed your presentation. I thought you did a perfect job, but I'm like really, I don't want to say demoralized, but what can we do about it? Seems like we don't have a lot of choices. That's why people aren't asking questions.
Robert's comment is, what do we do? Now that I've demoralized people, but what could we do, using Ukraine as a specific illustration of the dilemmas of economic warfare? If I had a magic bullet solution, I would have shared it here and beyond. I don't, but I think the way to think about it and approach it is not a search for the silver bullet. Hold the alliance together. That's writing out a year and a half ago. I think nobody would have predicted that would happen. That the strains, competition, friction among them. And this is not about a defensive territory, which is why NATO exists, to defend the territory of NATO member. Ukraine's not a member. This is a defense of values, which is much more abstract, but over the long term, probably more important. I mean, one of the things about alliances historically, you get lots of strange bedfellows, like us and the Saudis for decades. You say, where is the common value with Americans and Saudis? Common value is we both like oil. That's pretty fragile. But the human rights, civil liberties, democratic process, rule of law, international norms that are at stake in Ukraine, I think provides the reason, and that to the extent there's reason for encouragement, is that that's so far holding. When you get the Swiss to feel strongly enough to give up the neutrality that they've had forever to sign on to this particular effort, that's significant. I mean, you know, holding the Hungarians into it, even though they don't want to be in this at all. That is reason, small reason for optimism, but it means it requires constant attention to hold us together. Diane?
I was gonna say something similar to Robert, that,
Could you pull down the mask just while you're talking?
I was gonna say something similar to Robert's, point of view, and that is, so what do we do? So another way of phrasing that are, what are some alternatives that we have? Yeah, I think that we've got the will there, and it's impressive that NATO Plus has pulled together in this. After having been, very briefly in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia this last summer, we understood way better why they are going to be so adamant about defending Ukraine, because they were not defended.
Right.
But what are our alternatives to an economic warfare? We don't want a kinetic warfare. We don't want nuclear. So, what kind of pressure are some of the alternatives?
And you say, I don't have good alternatives, and I haven't heard alternatives that I thought were good. But I think elements of working on the factors that contribute to the strength of the coalition here, rather than deluding ourselves and our partners to think that there is a low-risk solution to this problem. That it probably is going to take continued infusion of ever more sophisticated weaponry for the Ukrainians to stand up against a country with 3 times the population. Keeping American and probably other NATO troops out, supporting from outside, not being on the ground, the boots on the ground aspect, I think makes it much more risky. And it's certainly more risky in terms of the domestic politics supporting it. But what specifically can be done in terms of accelerating the transition to sustainable economic usage? That the policies that have played out around Ukraine have clearly accelerated the transition in Europe. And the transition in Europe is a big deal because of the size of the markets and the economies in this. Not ignoring other problems, not using Ukraine as the excuse, the rationalization We can't do anything about rising sea level because we have to support the Ukrainians. And lots of analogs of that argument. It's going to mean we accept we're going to have to pay more to do more things. And granted, the $800 billion or whatever it is that we've given Ukraine so far is a pittance out of US GDP. But it's not a pittance if you're looking for universal preschool, extending healthcare benefits to other groups. You could do a lot with the alternative uses of money. So maintaining the clarity of arguments, and it may be my own proclivities, I don't think it's a good idea to lie to people. And I don't think it's a good idea to mislead or fool people by pretending that economic warfare instruments or something else can make it possible to avoid real costs and maybe some real pain in order to achieve objectives that we collectively decide are worth hanging in there to achieve. But that I realize that's not an answer. It's a strategy for pursuing an answer in the hope that somebody smarter than I am can come up with it. Lou, you've got a couple more?
Yeah, you've actually answered the first question, what can be done? So we'll skip over that one. This is a semantics question. Nancy, I'm sorry, is saying that all these things sound a lot like economic warfare, with warfare capitalized, that every state uses. So do we need a different term than economic warfare to describe these tactics? And if so, what is it?
Not kinetic.
I assume everybody on Zoom heard the question. Did everybody in the room hear it? Okay. As a general rule, I don't like maintaining the same terminology when you have a different meaning. An economic warfare means something different today than it did 50 years ago. So to use it is to be misleading, particularly for people who read history and think it's being repeated or applied. But I also have a problem with inventing new words. Well, the inventing of the words is not hard. It's the rationale for the read, the purpose that you achieve. And it's an extension of my dialogue with Diane and Robert. If we knew what we needed to do, we could call it a Super Mario grapefruit. It wouldn't matter. The key thing is knowing what it is we're going to try to do and how we're going to try and do it, and figuring out a bumper sticker explanation that people can understand. And I believe you do that best when you don't resort to old terminology that meant something else to your parents. The hard part is getting the new strategy, the new concept, the new agreement about what the goals are, agreement on what the steps are to achieving those goals. In the meantime, there's a need to tread water. There's a need to not make things worse. And by making things worse, what I'm referring to here is willfully or unintendedly misleading the public to get false expectations or unattainable expectations that then cause the tipping point here with, I won't support it anymore because you lied to me. The promise of sanctions, and I'm sick and tired of them on Cuba. We're not doing that anymore. That's what I want to avoid. I can make a good rationale for telling policymakers why they want to avoid that. I can't make a good alternative, here's the course of action that you should follow. And I hope there are people, I'm sure there are people working on it. I hope they come up with something sooner rather than later. We've run out the clock on another great decision session. I thank everybody who tuned in and is here. I hope it was worthwhile. Next week, the topic is Latin American politics, and our speaker will be Harold Trincunas, who is the academic director of the Center for National Security and Cooperation at Stanford. He is a Latin American specialist. I've worked with him on and off for many years, and I'm sure you will enjoy and learn from him. So thank you all. Lou, do you have any last minute?
I think not. I will turn off the recording and then stop the Zoom, and we should expect the recording to be available in a day or so.
Good.
And again, there were significant dropouts tonight in the audio. Apologize for that. We're going to try to figure out some technical solutions for the next session that will hopefully take care of that.
I'm sorry to hear that. And thank you all again for tuning in and being here. Good night, all.
Good night.
Thank you.